NIL has completely changed the rivalry between Utah and BYU, and we're discussing how on today's Locked On Utes and Locked On Cougars crossover.
You are Locked On College Crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes and Locked On Cougars your first listen every single day. We are available wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. If it's your first time listening, make sure you like and subscribe. Also, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. Visit FanDuel.com today to get started. My name is JT Wistrcill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. Excited to be joined by the host of Locked On Cougars, Jake Hatch. And Jake, it has been a busy offseason for Utah and BYU. We've seen major player movement with Utah players going to BYU. And when talking about how NIL has changed the game, I believe because of NIL, we're going to see more players than ever leave a Utah or a BYU and go to the rival, which I think will only add to the intensity of this rivalry.
While I agree with you, JT, I'm going to say right now, I think it's going to be more one-sided than many might want to give them credit for, because here's the deal. Right now, BYU's got the upper hand in this, and that's the concern. I know from the Utah side of things, you can buy anything with money. That's a running joke right now. Guess what? For years, a decade plus, while Utah was in the Pac-12, all BYU heard from Utah fans was, hey, you're in a poverty program. When are you going to start spending money? Well, all of a sudden, BYU starts spending the money, and some of the Utes don't like it. So pick your poison. Which side of the coin are you going to be on here, Utah?
You're absolutely right. Right now, BYU is the one. They landed Tanuvasa. You landed Carsen Ryan. And I'm trying to think out for Utah, like recent additions. Francis Bernard was obviously a major one. Yeah. And am I missing any other one, Jake?
John Henry Daly is a guy that I think has got a lot of
Logan Fano
as well. So it goes both ways. But right now, kind of the latest, what have you done for me lately? It's BYU with the upper hand. And the biggest thing, JT, is BYU for so many years, we all knew that money was exchanging hands under the table in previous eras of college athletics. And BYU would not get into that. That's just not something they were willing to do, is to break those rules. But now that NIL exists and it's above board and you're able to pay players to come and play for your university, guess what? BYU's in the game, and they're in it in a big way, and they got a bunch of financial backing to push the envelope a little bit too.
Yeah, that's the thing about all of this, right? Is it's in the game. Everyone is contributing in NIL right now. There's a lot made of Tanuvasa and everything that's going on, but BYU, Utah, whoever it is, they're just doing what everyone else is. So that's just part of what college sports are right now. And the Tanuvasa one, it does feel bigger than any other move we've seen made in like players swapping. Like, we're going to talk a little bit about Hunter Clegg later. And obviously we'll also get into Utah versus BYU basketball. What a crazy game that was this weekend, but that's happened before though. Things like a Hunter Clegg guy comes back from his mission. 2 years is a long time, changes his mind where he wants to go to college. Yeah, that's happened. Or even a guy, Logan Fano, John Henry Daly, not working out for me at one school. Let me go to the other and see if it works. But a player the level of Tanuvasa, operating at an extremely high level, and I've consistently said that throughout this whole thing, like, he is an incredible player, and I think a major get for BYU. Him choosing, and his own dad even came out and said, right, like, hey, Utah offered enough, but he still chose BYU. This whole thing still feels like a significant moment in this rivalry.
It is, because here's the deal: these are two rivals, and we all know this. Well, trust me, Saturday night, the basketball game, we'll get to this in a minute. Brett Borg, who's a very well-known Utah fan on X, aka Twitter, he puts that sign up there that says you can buy anything with money, and it's signed Satan and BYU. I'm like, you know what? That's what I love about this rivalry, JT, is it crosses all lines: religious, family, sports. Here's the deal. It has changed the dynamic here. And you're right. There are going to be guys who are going to exchange sides of the rivalry. And a lot of it's going to come down to an NIL check. And that's just, once again, that's this day and age of college sports. You may not like it. It may be ruining the proverbial sport for you, because I've seen some people out there say that NIL just taking my love for the game away. Great. It may take the love away, but guess what? That's what the future and the present and the past has been in college sports. It just so happens that you've got two rivals who are 40 minutes apart from each other, and they love nothing more than pulling one over on one another if they can possibly manage it.
They do. And right now, it's without a doubt that BYU has been able to do that better recently than Utah. I've talked about this before. BYU right now, I do believe they have better NIL resources. And, you could say like, oh, look at the transfer portal rankings, right? Utah's like 31st, BYU is wherever, but that stuff also changes so quickly based on the amount of players you add and put in. And Utah, as much as I love Utah, like they were going to have a lot of turnover on the offensive side of the ball because the offensive side of the ball was dreadful for Utah last year. So that was something major. And right now, BYU, whether it's landing an AJ Dumbansa, whether it's getting a prominent player like the Cougars just got in Tanuvasa, this is the name of the NIL game. And I think what's you got to be excited about if you're Utah, just as BYU, a team who was projected to win less than 5 games last season and ended up being the second best team in the Big 12, in my opinion. Utah has a chance to reshape their roster this offseason. They've tried to do that through the portal, and they're hoping to bounce back. So this also, NIL era, allows both of these teams to try and compete and turn around a bad season a lot quicker than they probably could have in the past.
Well, and you're right. And that's the thing about this is NIL has changed that whole dynamic there, especially with the transfer portal and being able to grab guys and try and fit them into your program. You're right. Previous eras of college sports, this would have been a multi-year rebuild for Utah, particularly on the offensive side of the football. BYU, they have had their druthers at times trying to rebuild things in their own program. But the one thing I love about this is it's allowing guys to have the freedom to move wherever and whenever they want, and at the same time benefit financially from it. And I don't care what the coaches have to say, having their issues with it. I know that there was a lot made of Kyle Whittingham saying it was the overarching reason why Cam Calhoun and Keanu Tanuvasa left Utah. Okay, Kyle, get in line. Every other coach in the entire country is saying that exact thing. Guess what? Guys are going to hear about the amounts of money that they can possibly pick up in the transfer portal, and everybody has a number, JT, all of us, you and I included. We have a number. If we're offered that number, hey, we'll do whatever it takes to go get that number. So you like I said, you may not like it, but it has changed the dynamic of college football, and it's also changed the dynamic of this rivalry. I think it's going to be one that is going to be that the fans are going to have to essentially just realize, yeah, these guys are going to change uniforms and they're going to be on opposite sides of the rivalry, and you're just going to have to deal with it. You may want to talk about loyalty. You may want to talk about this quote unquote new era. That's kind of been the phraseology that's been used out there by the Tanuvasa family. Great. So be it. It's what college football is and college sports in general is in this day and age. BYU is flashing a bunch of cash. And all I got to say to Utah fans who are upset about that is go and get your Huntsmans, go and get your Eccles, go and get those families who've got those deep pockets, get them on board, because I know the Gar family's doing its part. You got to find a few more of them. And I know that Utah's got some of them. You got to get them on board with the NIL game.
You are 1000% correct. At the end of the day, when your players say like, hey, I'm going to stay, and then they end up leaving, and then reports say, oh, it's maybe due because of NIL money. Well, obviously then if they were offered enough NIL money, they would have stayed with your institution. So that's where it is on Utah to try and get up to that level, to be able to compete. And yes, obviously it's frustrating when Tanuvasa leaves, but I do just, the one thing I enjoy about this era, Jake, is what we talked about. You brought this up earlier. We talked about coaches paying players under the table for years. That was more so about the SEC. I love that we have like a college football national championship game that doesn't feature the SEC, because in many ways now, whatever your thoughts on that in the past, we now know it's a more level playing field, which does get me excited. We both already talked about why there's reason to believe like, hey, if you have a down season now more than ever, it's not a multi-year rebuild to get back to the top. Arizona State was picked to finish dead last, and they won the conference. So pretty much anyone now is going to be able to make the case that like this could be their year in the portal, right?
Well, and that's the thing about it is ASU gives every program across the country hope, saying, hey, if we play our cards right, we get the right coach, get the right combination of players, we can go from what is essentially worst to first. And if you're a Utah fan looking at next year, you got to be thinking, okay, we retooled this offense. See what Jason Beck and company have got to do. BYU side of things, more of the same. They're bringing back essentially everybody from last year's squad that went 11-2, JT. So if you're a BYU fan, you're thinking, yeah, let's just go out and do it again. But this time, let's not lose to a Kansas, and let's punch our ticket to the Big 12 title game. Let's be Arizona State and actually win a game in the playoff. That's the whole mindset right now, is both of these programs should have a positive thought process about what next year can hold for both of them, albeit at different levels, it feels like.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there with Utah coming off the season they're coming off of. They're just hoping to, you believe that you can get back to that level, but it's a different expectation. BYU expects to be there. Utah's goal is to be there, but you cannot expect to be there with the type of season that you had. You mentioned BYU players and bringing a lot back. Also bringing a couple over from Utah. I want to talk about those changes, the players that change sides, some of the recruits versus some of the more veterans, talk about the different levels of loss that they are. We're going to be diving into all of that in one moment. But first, today's crossover episode of Locked On Utes and Locked On Cougars is brought to you by our friends at Prize Picks. This message is brought to you by Prize Picks, the place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings, Prize Picks has changed the game in daily fantasy sports. Whether it's the playoffs or regular season, Prize Picks has made it easier than ever to win big while enjoying the football action. Now it's playoff time, and there's no better way to get in on the action than with Prize Picks. Here's how it works. You simply pick more or less on at least two players, and if your picks hit, you could win up to 1,000 times your cash. Yes, that's right. 1,000 times your money just by making a few simple picks. For me, I'm all about the hot takes this season. This week on Prize Picks, we got the AFC and NFC championship games. I'm looking for Patrick Mahomes to go over 250 passing yards. And how about Travis Kelce? More than 70 receiving yards coming off a 100-yard game. It's really easy and fun to predict and just so easy to play with Prize Picks, Flex and Play, where you can still double your money even if one of your picks doesn't hit. And with the app, you'll get your winnings fast, sometimes in as little as 15 minutes. Ready to run your game this football season? Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege, all caps, no spaces, to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 just for playing. Don't wait. Take your game to the next level with Prize Picks. Prize Picks, run your game today. All right, Jake Hatch, talking about the players that have left Utah to go to BYU. Going to talk about the biggest losses to ones that maybe aren't as important but could still be felt. Let's just start with the biggest one, Keanu Tanuvasa. I love Utah fans. I've seen Utah fans try and talk themselves into this not being a big of a loss. And I love Morgan Scalley. I even saw Morgan Scalley talking about every year we lose players and we got the guys to replace them and it'll be fine. Utah will not be fine losing Tanuvasa. Could their defense still be solid next year? Absolutely. I like Aliki Vaimaki. Dallas Vailaki came on really strong as a freshman. He could do nice things. But when you lose, it's not just about Tanuvasa. It's about who else you lost to. You lose Samote Pepa and you lose Junior Tafuna, one of the hearts and soul of your defense. That altogether is a major loss. I think Tanuvasa was going to be one of the best defensive linemen in the Big 12 when he was with Utah. That doesn't change now. He's at BYU. He's an absolute game wrecker whose stats do not tell the full value that he brings.
Well, and that's the thing about this is BYU is very happy to have him because here's the deal. When he's healthy, he's as good as they come. And BYU had two very good defensive tackles in their own right in John Nelson and Blake Mangelson, who are both exiting the program. So they needed some guys on the interior of that defensive line. And if you can add a guy the caliber of a Keanu Tanuvasa, yeah, BYU, there's a reason why Cougar fans were celebrating wildly when he picked the Cougars because he is a day one starter and he has got the potential to be an all Big 12 performer. And considering what BYU got out of the guys on the D-line last year, they got to be thinking, okay, we were pretty good on the D-line a year ago, but with a guy of Keanu Tanuvasa's ability, how much better can they be? Well, that means that BYU defense could be even better than it was this past season, and it was a pretty stingy defense in its own right.
It was. Now you get a true game wrecker. Guy's going to eat up double teams and create pressure on the interior. But he's not the only starter that BYU is able to add. And this goes back to the first topic. We're not talking about players who left BYU and came into Utah. We've done that in the past. Logan Fano, John Henry Daly. Not this year, which it's a year in which obviously BYU finished the year as a top 20 team. Maybe could have even done things in the college football playoff had their season gone differently versus Utah lost 7 of their last 8. So that's where you're going to see the recruiting trends swing towards BYU because college football is such a year-to-year type basis. I think about all the momentum that Alabama continues to lose as they have another just disappointing season for their standard. But getting back to another player that left Utah to go to BYU, Carsen Ryan. This is another interesting one to me because Ryan, projected starter at tight end. There's been a lot made of the tight end position not being as important in Jason Beck's offense, and Utah was able to keep Landon King. But here's, at the end of the day, it goes down to this, and I'm really high on Landon King. The best tight end on Utah's roster returning was going to be Carsen Ryan. He was a starter at UCLA too. It's tough when you see your rival at a player. This is not as major of a loss as Tanuvasa to me, but this is still a loss because I could easily see Carsen Ryan burning Utah for a couple catches when those two teams meet up next fall.
Here's the deal about Carsen is he is going to be the starting tight end for BYU this year. They had a bunch of guys. They had a pretty bloated tight end room, speaking of BYU, but quite frankly, from my vantage point, none of them lived up to the potential that I thought they had in them. Now, a guy like Reiner Swanson, who's a true freshman, you see it with him, but he's going on a mission. He's exiting. He's leaving for 2 years to go to Nairobi, Kenya, and I wish him well as he exits the program for a couple of seasons. But that opens the door for a guy like Carsen Ryan to come in and be a featured guy for BYU. And I know the Cougar fans are out there shouting, "Well, Aaron Roderick doesn't value his tight ends. He doesn't throw to him." Jake, hey, here's the deal. When there is a tight end that is going to be good enough to demand the football, Aaron Roderick's offense will get the ball to them. And a guy like Carsen Ryan, he's got that potential in him. So we'll see what he's capable of, because he is a very, very good player.
He is a really good player. And real quick on Aaron Roderick, was there any discussions about moving on from him? Is the negative vitriol he gets, Jake, is that more fan fueled than inside the program? Do you feel like, where do you kind of stand on A-Rod?
It's from outside. Here's the deal. Okay. He's beloved in that program. Kalani Sitake trusts him implicitly as his offensive coordinator. He's done a very good job recruiting by and large. He has found quarterback after quarterback to keep this offense rolling. Anybody who's upset with what Aaron Roderick's put out on the field, if you don't like 11-win seasons, find another coordinator that can deliver that.
That's what Utah's trying to do, is find a coordinator that can deliver an 11-win season. And they used to have one in Andy Ludwig, but college football changes very rapidly. Speaking of changes rapidly, Hunter Clegg, originally committed to come to Utah. I talked about this when Utah landed that 2023 recruiting class a long time ago. And I'm not saying this to toot my own horn. I'm just saying this is how college football works. People will get so fired up over recruiting classes, but it doesn't always go to fruition. Utah added 3 4-star running backs in the 2023 cycle. Not a single one is with the program and team anymore. And what a big addition they had a couple years ago was Hunter Clegg, and now he's going to the Cougars. This is another substantial loss. In the transfer portal era, losing a recruit will never be as important to me as losing a player the level of Tanuvasa, a proven commodity, but this still hurts. I mean, Clegg's got all the potential in the world to be a dude at this level.
Well, that's the thing about this is BYU, they're very excited to have Hunter Clegg because, as you mentioned, absolute game record when he's at the high school level, what he's capable of. Excuse me. Wow.
No, you are good. Yeah. And that's one of those things.
But I'm still getting over the flu, and I apologize for that. But the biggest thing is about Hunter Clegg is when he's at the high school level, he flashed all the potential in the world. And that's why every program in the country wanted him. When Utah won that recruiting battle, major win for them. For BYU to now get him into their program, Cougars, they're very excited for him because they lose guys like a Logan Fano and a John Henry Daly to Utah. That's a blow. But to get a guy the caliber of a John Henry Daly, get a guy the caliber of Hunter Clegg back into BYU, that's a little bit of a recompense on the back end.
It is. And the quote, I believe it was Steve Bartle of KSL Sports had the story about it, and it might have been Mitch Harper as well for KSL Sports, but just talking about some of your colleagues, Jake, just talking about how this was so, like, the quote from Clegg was basically like, "Oh, I've always loved BYU, but their just program wasn't at a point when I left for my mission for me to commit to them." So that's such a compliment now that now he's like, "No, they're there now. So now I'm going to be there."
Well, that's the thing. He sees what Jay Hill is building with this BYU defense. And yeah, when he left, that defense was not in a situation where he was probably like, I want to go and feature in that. Utah's was. Now he sees what Jay Hill is building, and it tailor-made to what he does as a defensive end or an edge player. Yeah, there's a reason why he has come back around to BYU after 2 years.
It's a big get, and he's not the only elite edge player that the Cougars were able to land. And this goes back to what we just touched on a little bit with Clegg. It's about a bigger level that BYU has been able to take themselves as a program. Tausili Akana was former 4-star top player in his class. I think it was 23, may have been 20. I'm pretty sure 23. He went to Texas. It didn't work out there. Entered the portal. Now he's at BYU. When you look back on that 23 class, it's drastically different. Yeah. If Utah has the season that BYU just had, maybe he's coming to Utah, but now we're seeing some of these top players in the state, the former high recruits, when they come to Utah, they say, I want to go to what currently is the best football program in the state, and justifiably so, they're saying BYU right now.
Well, a kid like Akana, he's an interesting case because I'll be honest, he didn't give BYU much of a shot out of high school, but I think it goes back to what we were just talking about. At that point, the BYU defense just wasn't in a spot where it was all that attractive. Now it is. Now it's a program that all of a sudden you're like, okay, they're doing some things here, and they got some dudes making plays. Why can't I go do that? Now, Akana's going to have to bulk up a little bit. He's still a tweener, but his skill set, his pass rush ability, you can't match it. So I'm excited to see him and Clegg grow together in this BYU defense.
Being at some of those high school games, you and I, Jake, used to call some of those games in the past with KSL Sports, watching those guys wreck games and now going, oh, now they're at BYU? Dang. That's where
Yeah.
that hurts. And Jake, it hurts me to see you sick, by the way. I'm sure you were just starting to feel better. And then last night's Utah versus BYU basketball game happens, and it just turns the corner back in the opposite way. So I just hate seeing you sick, my friend. And I don't want to relive the wound too much, but we are going to dive back into what happened last night between Utah, or 2 nights ago, by the time all of you are listening, between Utah and BYU. We're going to be discussing that in one moment. But first, we have to talk to you about our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets. If you win your first bet, that's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keep every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings. Whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs, FanDuel has you covered. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Speaking of the NFL, the AFC and NFC championship games are set. Are the Chiefs going to do it again against the Bills? Is Josh Allen finally going to have his moment? Then the Commanders shocked everyone, made a deep run, but it still goes through the Eagles. How are they going to fare? And outside of just the NFL, we got NBA, we got NHL, college basketball. We have one college football game left to bet on: Ohio State versus Notre Dame. This 8.5-point line is very interesting. Jake, I want to talk with you about it a little bit too. Honestly, I don't know. I'm still going to ride Ohio State, and I'll still take the 8.5. I just think this team is playing the right way right now, and I'm going to take them to cover. How do you see this game?
Give me the Fighting Irish. I just personal opinion, I can't stand Ohio State. So give me Marcus Freeman. Give me the Fighting Irish. Give me a Notre Dame covering that and winning the Natty.
As this goes back to, did Notre Dame beat you guys when you guys, and I'm not even doing this to be a joke, Notre Dame beat you guys when they played in Vegas, right?
Yes, they did. And BYU's been on the wrong end of a bunch of games against Notre Dame in their history. But yeah. My personal opinion on the matter, can't stand the Buckeyes. So give me Notre Dame.
One college football game left. Head over to FanDuel today to get in on the action. Jake, the start of this year, Utah and BYU basketball. Hype and excitement couldn't be more polar opposites. My hairline compared to yours, for example, which is why I usually wear a hat when I'm on these shows. Polar opposites, as we said. But that's the thing about expectations, which is something we've talked about several times on this show. Arizona State picked finish last, BYU under there. It all comes down to what actually happens when it played out. Utah basketball had kind of been ascending going into the game, won a couple Big 12 games going into it. BYU, underwhelming, a little disappointing. And lo and behold, a big second half performance from Ezra Asar, a couple clutch plays in overtime. Utah gets a big win in the Huntsman Center against their heated rival.
Well, and that's the thing about it is Utah did everything that BYU, the book's out on BYU. Get physical with them and just they'll cower away. And that's one thing that BYU struggles with is physical basketball players. And Ezra Asar, that dude brought it. 24 of his 26 points, a career high in the second half of that game. Props to that young man. Very impressive stuff. And if BYU can make a dang free throw, might have been a different story.
True. And I think that's what's so surprising when you talk about the lack of physicality. You look at Foose, you look at Keba Keita. That's surprising when you hear that, but then you see it play out yesterday and Utah was able to impose their will.
Yeah, I don't know what BYU is going to have to do to find more of a backbone or more cojones, as it were, as a team, but they got to find it quickly because they are getting beat up on the interior in particular, but at the same time, interior guys can only do so much when the guys on the perimeter aren't doing their part as well. So there's a lot of concern with BYU overall.
Yeah, and what's also just still wild is to think like, yes, this game went in overtime. You talked about BYU not hitting the free throws and getting enough, like the 4 for 10. The fact that Utah was 53% from the line, 17 for 32. I mean, come on. Like if you're a high school team.
Yeah, these two teams combined to shoot 50% from the free throw line. That's abysmal. On
That's
42 attempts, absolutely brutal numbers. And I'm not going to lie, the lack of confidence BYU exhibits at the free throw line right now, it's pretty darn pathetic. When you have a guy who's a career 78% free throw shooter in Trevin Nell, who goes to the line down one with a 1-and-1 with a chance to take the lead, and he just strong arms the first one, clinks off the back iron. Like, all right, well, yeah, there's some issues with BYU currently.
There are, but you know what? Utah needed this win more than the Cougars. I know the Kevin Young era is still young and everything. just all the negative momentum that Craig Smith had coming into the season. I think Craig Smith's a good coach. I just think it's hard also to get Utah basketball going right now. It's easier said than done a little bit too, but this had to mean more for Utah. You get Chris Burgess going back to BYU. You get Keba Keita transferring from Utah to BYU. So for them to be able to get this win, finally get a good crowd in the Huntsman Center too. I know Utah basketball had been ascending. It's compared to some of the struggles BYU had. It still feels like Utah needed this more, right, Jake?
Well, they did need a win. Here's the deal. You're right. Craig Smith, he's been under the gun, obviously, and I cover Utah and BYU in my radio job here in Salt Lake City, as most people know. And the one thing about Utah was that this is a very, very proud program, speaking of Utah basketball, that's fallen on some pretty hard times. We'll see if they can recapture some of this magic. Sitting at 500 in conference play right now, that's a pretty impressive feat for Utah, whereas it's just as disappointing for BYU to be 2-4 right now. This is a team, as you mentioned, the hype coming into the season, it is absolutely the substance has not matched that hype whatsoever for the Cougars, but my hat goes off to Utah. They needed that win, and they went out and found a way to get it.
They did. It was a gutsy performance, and I'd love to be wrong, but Utah cling to that 500 Big 12 record for as long as you can. You got Houston coming up here right around the corner. Get Kansas eventually too. So it only gets tougher, but it is, it's just been incredible to see how Craig Smith has reshaped this roster. Not always for the best, right? Like you need the big performance from Ezra Asar, but this is college basketball. You're throwing the new pieces together. You're running Caleb Lohner out there. It's basketball, football, the crazy hybrid you got going on there. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the rest of the season goes for Utah basketball, for BYU basketball. But I mean, it is so interesting, Jake. I feel like no matter what happens with BYU basketball, there's just so much hype and excitement that still goes into next year because of Tanuvasa.
Well, there is. And obviously BYU's had a really good run on the recruiting trail. Obviously you've got high level talent coming into Provo. The issue is when you bring that level of talent into a program, well, guess what? The expectations go up commensurate to the level of talent you have. You have the number one prospect in next year's recruiting cycle who's going to be calling BYU home next year. Okay, this year, it's not living up to the hype right now for BYU, but Kevin Young, he's got to figure some things out with this team because you can't afford to continue to fall on your face. Yes, I know that he said he wants to make BYU a NBA factory and have guys come into this program and advance to play professional basketball. Well, guess what? That's great and all. Cougar fans at the same time, they want the byproduct to be wins and wins in bunches. They don't want to see a middling or bottom tier Big 12 program while you're trying to develop that talent. And the other thing is, if you continue to be a team that's kind of middling, those top rated prospects, they'll look elsewhere eventually.
That's exactly what we talked about with Utah football earlier, with the top players choosing then to go to a program that's been superior, at least this last year was, in BYU football. So crazy to see how it goes. Last thing I want to mention about this game, just because we were talking about some of the guys from BYU to the Utah guys to BYU. How about Hunter Erickson? A guy who, so I called his games at Salt Lake Community College, like to see him step up in the biggest moments. If you would have told me that Utah was going to win this game with Gabe Madsen going 1 of 13 from 3 and 2 of 12 from the field, I would have thought you were crazy, and they find a way.
Well, and that's the thing about it is it was a very gutsy performance. You mentioned guys like Ezra Asar stepping up, Hunter Erickson stepping up in big moments. You got to have moments like that from guys because the opposing team knows who the other team's best players are, and they're going to shut those guys down. Yep. You got to have those traditional role players step up in those big moments. Hunter Erickson, a former Cougar, obviously a big moment for him to get some revenge on his former team.
Was big night for Utah basketball, and one thing I do love about basketball is it's not the last time these guys see each other. BYU is going to be fired up, and especially the Craig Burgesses, the Keba Keitas of the world. Like they want another shot at Utah. They get them, and they get them in their house in a few weeks. So it's going to be fun to continue to watch that play out.
Let me just add that it's cool to have these two back in the same conference.
So cool.
Last time they were together in a conference was 2011, obviously, and that was the heyday of Jimmer Fredette. But the thing about this is these are two teams, strong basketball tradition with both of them. And the fact that they'll be playing twice annually for the foreseeable future, that should excite you as a Cougar or Ute fan. I don't care which side of the rivalry you fall on.
1000%. It's so, I always want to play your rival at whatever level of sport. You always want to play your rival. It just makes it fun. I know the social media stuff gets over the line. And then obviously even at the football game this year, a lot of stuff over the line, but at the end of the day, playing the rival, it's what it's about. It's the fun, it's the passion, it's the energy, and that passion and energy when players transfer from one team to the other only amplifies it. So football season is going to be a blast when this game gets here, but still got one more basketball game. Jake, always a blast doing these with you, my friend.
Absolutely. We'll see everybody on March 8th. How about that?
March 8th. March 8th. Can't wait indeed. All right, Jake, thanks again. Good to see you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, buddy.
That's going to do it for today's Locked On Utes and Locked On Cougars crossover. We'll be coming at you all week long with more Utah and BYU content.